President Donald J. Trump delivering what at least I believe to be his most powerful speech that he's given as President of the United States, from certainly the most moving setting. It followed a remarkable speech as well from President Macron. President Trump began by talking about gathering here on freedom's altar. And the speech had to be reassuring to the allies who he had been in at least pitched rhetorical battle with over the past several years, talking about an alliance that is unbreakable, talking about British resolve, French valor, the fighting Poles, the intrepid Aussies who made this possible. Now, the laying of the wreath and a moment of silence.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as Presidents Macron and President Trump greet the World War II veterans.
Mika, as President Trump and President Macron greet the World War II D-Day vets, your thoughts on the President's speech?
Well, I think the entire ceremony was beautiful, and it is an education within itself. You really feel the magnitude of this moment in history, even 75 years later, and to see the veterans who were there sitting on the stage is something you hope to never forget in your life. And Trump's speech itself was very good and measured up to the moment, and really was a true salute to the unity of this day. And he spoke about not only the sacrifices that were made, but our allies and the importance of unity. It was a really good speech.
It did measure up to the moment, as you said. It seems that Ronald Reagan, in 1984, on the 40th anniversary, really set the stage for these commemorations. It was remarkable, the words that he spoke, that Peggy Noonan helped craft about the boys of Pointe du Hoc. very moving. Other presidents did not fare quite as well. Bill Clinton and George W. Bush come to mind. But Willie, the president, President Trump, had several high moments. Of course, we'll all be talking about the men that he spoke of, but there will be headlines from this speech, and certainly, I think across Europe at least, among our allies, they will be positive headlines. The president, again, talking about British resolve and French valor, talking about the fighting Poles, talking about the intrepid Aussies, but also talking about an alliance that was forged in war, strengthened in peace, and is unbreakable today. Those are words that our allies have wanted to hear from this commander-in-chief for some time, and perhaps it was this remarkable setting that finally it got the president to say what they had been wanting to hear for the first 2.5 years of his presidency.
Yeah, one of the last lines of that speech, Joe, was "God bless our allies," right before he said "God bless America." We'll see now if he has policy and further rhetoric that lives up to that. But I totally agree with both of you. I thought it was a terrific speech. I thought he did a great job telling the story of D-Day through the men and women who were sitting there behind them. I thought it was preceded by another great speech from President Macron, who expressed the awe and gratitude we're all feeling today. The line that President Trump delivered, quote, "You are among the greatest Americans who will ever live. You are the pride of our nation. You are the glory of our republic." And isn't that the truth? Michael Beschloss, I thought he weaved together also, I'm glad he acknowledged Marion Wynn, the 92-year-old who as a teenager became a pipe welder to join the war effort as 6 million other women did, and also whose brother died and who lays in the American cemetery there behind the ceremony today.
Yes, I sure agree with you, Willie, that this day is really about the vets, and especially because this is probably the last time that we'll be able to have a ceremony like this with so many people who were active in the war effort and who were heroes of D-Day. The thing I thought was interesting, especially contrasted with all those other celebrations where American presidents attended, was before Donald Trump spoke, when we heard from President Macron, it was almost a lecture to our president, and he kept on saying, "Dear President Trump," and he would say things like, "America's never better than when we were fighting, America's fighting for freedom and for democratic ideals," and he offered to renew the friendship with France. That's something you would never have had to have a French president do before in our history. So I hope that this is something that closes the circle with some healing, and that when President Trump said those nice things about our allies and about our alliance, I hope he really means it, and I hope he'll remember what he said beyond today.
Let us hope that tweets do not follow.
Let this moment breathe.
He gets
Just
up there,
what I
of
had
course,
in mind.
Well, let's hope this moment continues. And all I will say of President Macron's words and challenges to the president, I also, David Ignatius, am glad that the president chose to have the discipline to stick to script and deliver what, again, I believe is the strongest speech of his presidency. And there was one especially beautiful moment, and I loved the thought, because any World War II documentary you see, any Vietnam documentary you see, when the interviewer starts talking about them being heroes, they will tear up and they'll say the heroes were the ones that never came back. Well, President Trump said that that's what these heroes were saying. The heroes were the ones buried here behind us. And yet he went on to say, to talk about the remarkable life that was created by this generation, who Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. And you can take the ending of Saving Private Ryan, where Tom Hanks' character said to Private Ryan, "Earn this," as he lay dying on that bridge. That's what this generation did. They earned this.
Well, I thought President Trump hit pretty much every note right in this speech. It was well written. It was well delivered. I think he came here understanding that this was an event that required him to tell the American story, not Donald Trump's story, not a personal evocation, but something about what really resonates through presidencies, through generations. And we heard it. And as we heard the president tell the stories of these veterans behind him and that frail rising to receive the applause of the audience, I think all of us felt that President Trump on our behalf was thanking these brave, now old men who came here 75 years ago. So today was a day when President Trump got it right, and I think we all feel that watching and listening to him.
He got it right not only by talking about what the United States did, but Mike, I think most importantly, raising our allies up, lifting our allies up just as Macron had lifted us up, lifting up those who made victory over Hitler possible.
He did do that, and the speech was much more than just appropriate. And that's a high bar for Donald Trump that we've all become familiar with. But now the question is, off of what he said about the alliance that was formed literally here with the lives of these people, these young men behind us, buried now for 75 years, the crux of that speech is going to be when Angela Merkel leaves here today, when Macron leaves here today, when the leaders of Norway and Poland sitting watching the speech, in Dublin watching the speech, what are they going to be saying? They're going to be saying, well, which Donald Trump are we going to get tomorrow? Or which Donald Trump are we going to get next week in negotiations about NATO? Which Donald Trump are we going to get when he comes to talk about tariffs? Are we going to get the Donald Trump we've become used to? Or are we going to get the Donald Trump who is clearly more than appropriate here today in his remarks?
So I wrote earlier this week in the Washington Post about separating the ground noise from the signal. There certainly was a lot of ground noise leading in to this trip, talking about supposed insults and debates whether Princess was insulted or not. If you look at the signal, and for me that is, how does he treat our allies when he is overseas? You look at actually, Mika, the generosity of spirit he showed to Theresa May, someone that he has been quite fierce with in the past, and what he said here today, I think safe to say this is one of his more successful trips abroad, if not his most successful trip abroad.
Well,
let me say.
Okay. Up.
Thus far.
Thus far.
And as an American, I'm hoping we can all say that when we are in the studio next week.
This is an event that is about much more than him, and we've got much more ahead to cover. Incredible stories, including Andrea Mitchell will be joining us with more on the story of the woman who is here.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.